They say Boston is one of the oldest cities in the United States, but how old exactly? Well, to put it in perspective, let's just say when it was founded, there were still beavers roaming free across the land. And if that isn't proof enough of its age, well, this next fact will be January 15th, 1919, Boston, USA. The city's busy North End district was filled with workers, children, and horses, pulling carts. Suddenly, a giant storage tank holding millions of gallons of molasses burst open and a deadly brown wave swept through the streets. Welcome to this channel. Today we are exploring the Great Molasses Flood of 1919. In 1916, the United States imported over 84 million gallons of molasses from the Caribbean, and because Boston was a major port city, it received a large portion of those imports. In fact, by 1917, the demand for molasses in New England alone had grown to 200 million gallons annually, so it was no surprise that by January 15, 1919, a molasses storage tank was being constructed in Boston's North End. It was a massive structure, 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, which would eventually hold 2.3 million gallons of molasses. But as the story goes, on the morning of January 15, 1919, the tank hadn't yet been filled. It was just past 12:30 p.m., and the sounds of traffic rumbled through the neighborhood. The steady clip-clop of horses pulling carts was drowned out only by the shouts of vendors and factory whistles nearby. For most of the residents, it was just another day in the bustling port city. That is, until everything changed in the blink of an eye. Without any warning whatsoever, the walls of the molasses tank cracked and split open. People heard the rumble of collapsing metal and saw a dark wave rushing towards them, and before anyone could react, it was upon them. A wave 25 feet high surged out from the tank and poured onto the streets below. Thick and dark, it carried the stench of rotting wood and overripe fruit as it moved forward with terrifying speed. At first, the wave appeared to be harmless, but within seconds it crashed into a house, smashing it to pieces. Windows shattered and wooden beams flew through the air as the wave continued on its path of destruction. Homes and wagons alike were tossed aside like bath toys in a giant bathtub. Lampposts were ripped from the ground and sent flying down the street, and as the wave spread outwards, it seemed as though nothing could stop it. It moved like a freight train, carrying away everything in its path, and within minutes, entire city blocks were wiped away, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. At the time, the wave was moving at 35 miles per hour. There was no way for people to outrun it. Within moments, it had covered an entire mile and was still gaining speed. The wave was so powerful that it turned the streets into sticky rivers of molasses. People screamed and ran for their lives, but many couldn't get out of its way fast enough. Those who were caught in the flood were trapped in a thick syrup, unable to move or call for help. And soon the horrifying cries of those in peril filled the air. Cars, wagons, and carts overturned and spilled their contents into the sticky mess. Some tried to reverse their tracks, but the molasses was too thick and they became stuck. Others waded through the flood, desperately trying to reach safety, but they, too, quickly became prisoners of the sticky situation. Houses were demolished and scattered like building blocks. Windows, doors, and roof tiles floated around like fallen stars in a dark night sky. And as the flood made its way through the city, the stench of rotting wood and overripe fruit hung heavy in the air. The wave finally came to a halt after it had traveled 2.5 miles from the storage tank, but the damage it left in its wake was catastrophic. Buildings were destroyed, streets were impassable, and people were trapped in this sticky mess. It was a scene of utter devastation, and panic quickly set in among the residents. As news of the disaster spread, rescuers rushed to the scene, but they, too, quickly found themselves in trouble. Their boots stuck in the molasses as they tried to pull out those who were trapped. The flood was so thick and heavy that it took several hours for the rescuers to free some of the victims. In the end, 21 people were killed, 150 injured, and countless others left homeless. To make matters worse, the flood caused over $1 million in damages, equivalent to nearly $17 million today. Amidst the destruction, the true horror of the disaster slowly emerged. Many of those trapped in the flood had been horses pulling carts and wagons. They had become stuck in the sticky syrup and were unable to free themselves. Some had managed to stand up, but soon collapsed and drowned in the molasses. Others had panicked and gone down in a blaze of glory, kicking and screaming as they disappeared beneath the surface. As the rescuers pulled the dead and dying from the flood, they found horses and people alike stuck in the sticky syrup. Some of the animals were still harnessed to their carts, while others had broken free but couldn't escape the molasses. The sight was heartbreaking, and many of the rescuers were moved to tears. But despite the tragedy, there were some bright spots. Several people were saved, bystanders and rescuers alike, and in the aftermath, the community came together to help those who had lost everything. Bofta was determined to recover from this disaster and rebuild itself. So began the long process of cleaning up the city. Workers spent weeks scraping molasses off the streets and buildings, and as they did, they uncovered more horrors. Many of the buildings were severely damaged and had to be demolished. Streets were impassable and businesses were forced to close. The disaster had devastated the local economy and left thousands without jobs. As the cleanup continued, investigators set out to determine what had caused the disaster, and what they found was a combination of poor construction and company negligence. The storage tank had been built with weak steel plates, and the company had ignored warning signs of leaks. Greed and a need to rush construction to meet demand likely played a role in the disaster. In the end, the company was fined $20,000, equivalent to over $350,000 today, and several of its executives were charged with involuntary manslaughter. But no amount of money or punishment could bring back those who had been lost. The Great Molasses Flood had taken a terrible toll on the city, and in the aftermath, Bofta was determined to make sure it never happened again. Building and safety codes were tightened, and the city began to invest in public works projects to improve the quality of life for its residents. It was a slow process, but over time, Boston rebuilt itself and emerged stronger than ever before. Today, the memory of the Great Molasses Flood lives on in Boston. On hot summer days, locals say you can still smell molasses in the North End, and every year, the city remembers those who were lost with a moment of silence on January 15th. The Great Molasses Flood was a tragedy that could have been avoided. With a little more care and attention to detail, the storage tank could have been built to withstand the pressure of the molasses. And maybe the executives weren't so greedy and cut corners to meet demand. It wasn't fire, water, or war that killed Bofta. It was a flood of sugar. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 proved that sometimes even sweetness can turn deadly. Thank you for watching.